Right. Unbroken chapter 17 is called Typhoon, and it starts on page 177. And if you remember at the end of chapter 16, Louis had heard voices singing in the sky, and then right at the end there, they saw land. Louis and Phil saw land. That was really exciting. So here we go with Typhoon. All day, under a dark, gyrating sky, like moving, dancing, Louis and Phil rode the swell, straining their eyes westward and feeling a weary thrill as the bump on the horizon peeked into view. Slowly, as the current carried them toward it, the island became more distinct. They could see a bright white line where waves dashed against something, maybe a beach, maybe a reef. In the afternoon, one island became two, and then a dozen or so, lined up like rail cars. The castaways had expected that if they ever saw land, they'd be rapturous. Instead, they discussed it matter-of-factly. They were too weak for anything more, and there were pressing worries. Overhead, a huge storm was gathering. In training, Louis and Phil had memorized the geography of the Central Pacific. They knew that the islands ahead had to be part of the Gilberts or Marshalls, enemy territory. Between them, the two island groups had dozens of atolls and islands. Remember, that's like a little coral island. So there was a good likelihood that there were places unoccupied by the Japanese. Louis and Phil decided to hang offshore until they found an island that looked uninhabited or inhabited only by natives. They began rowing over the wind-chapped sea, turning parallel to the island so they could wait until night to slip ashore. So even though they're seeing land, they still have to be careful because they don't know that it'll be safe when they get to land. The sky broke all at once. A sudden slashing rain came down, and the islands vanished. The ocean began heaving and thrashing. The wind slapped the raft in one direction, then another, sending it spinning up swells perhaps 40 feet, then careening down into troughs as deep as canyons. Phil and Louis had drifted into what was almost certainly a typhoon, which is a big water storm. Wave after wave slammed into the raft, tipping it sideways and peeling it upward, on the verge of overturning. To try to stop it from flipping, Louis and Phil bailed in water as ballast, positioned themselves on opposite sides to balance their weight, and lay on their backs to keep the center of gravity low. Knowing that if they were thrown loose, they'd never get back in, Louis reeled in the raft cord, looped it around the cushion the cushion sewn into the center of the raft, threaded it through a grommet, then wound it around his waist and Phil's waist, pulling it taut. So basically, they're just tying themselves to the raft so that they won't get thrown out into the water. They pushed their feet under the cushion, leaned back, and held on. Night fell, and the storm pounded. The raft raced up and down hundreds of mountains of water. At times in the darkness, they felt the strange lightness of flying as the raft was swept into the air off the tops of the waves. Louis felt more intensely afraid than he had felt as the Green Hornet was falling. Across from him, Phil lay in grim silence. Both men thought of the nearness of the land they could no longer see. They feared that any second they'd be flung into a reef. And keep in mind that they have been starving for weeks, and so they're not strong enough to really swim, right? The raft is the only way they can survive. Sometime in the night, the storm sagged and softened, then moved on. The swells remained, but their tops became smooth. Louis and Phil freed themselves from the raft cord and awaited daylight. In the dark, they could smell soil, greenness, rain washing over living things. There was the smell of land. It flirted with them all night, growing stronger. As dawn neared, they could hear the hiss of water scouring a reef. Exhausted, they decided to take turns napping, with one man on the lookout for land. Somewhere along the way, they both fell asleep. They woke in a new universe. They had drifted into the embrace of two small islands. On one island, they saw huts, trees heavy with fruit, but no people. They had heard of the Japanese enslaving native populations and moving them en masse off their home islands, and they thought that perhaps this had been the fate of this island's inhabitants. So they're thinking the people must have been moved because they don't see any people when they land. They pulled their shoes over their sore-pocked feet and began rowing for shore. From overhead came the whine of engines. They looked up and saw Zeros, these planes looping through combat maneuvers, far too high for their pilots to notice the raft below. They rowed on. Louis had predicted that they'd find land on the 47th day. Phil had chosen the day before, because they had spotted land on the day Phil had chosen and were about to reach it on the day Louis had chosen. They decided they'd both been right. They could see more islands now. Louis spotted a tiny island to their left and pointed it out to Phil, describing it as having one tree on it. Then a strange thing happened. The lone tree became two trees. After a moment's confusion, the men suddenly understood. It wasn't an island, and those weren't trees. It was a boat. It had been perpendicular to them, right, at a 90-degree angle, leaving only one mast visible, and then it had turned, bringing the rearward mast into view. Louis and Phil ducked. They rowed as fast as they could, trying to get to shore before the sailors spotted them. They were too late. The boat made a sharp turn and sped toward them. The weakened men couldn't row fast enough to escape. They gave up and stopped. The boat drew alongside the raft, and Louis and Phil looked up. Above them was a machine gun mounted on the boat's bow. Along the deck stood a line of men, all Japanese. Each one held a weapon pointed at the castaways. One of the Japanese opened his shirt and pointed to his chest. He seemed to want the Americans to do the same. As Louis opened his shirt, he braced himself, expecting to be shot, but no shot came. The man had only wanted to see if they were armed. One of the sailors threw a rope at the raft, and Louis caught it. Louis and Phil tried to climb onto the boat, but their legs were too weak. The sailors brought out a rope ladder, tied the castaways to it, and dragged them up, then pulled the rest aboard. On the deck, Louis and Phil attempted to rise, but their legs buckled. Think about this. They haven't really stood up in 47 days. The Japanese were impatient for the men to move across the deck, so the Americans crawled on all fours. When they reached the mast, they were picked up and lashed to it. So they're tied to the post on the boat. Their hands were bound behind their backs. One of the sailors began speaking to them in Japanese. He seemed to be asking questions. Louis and Phil offered responses, trying to guess what the man wanted to know. Because remember, they don't speak the same language. A soldier waved a bayonet past Louis' face, trying to hack off his beard. Another man cracked a pistol across Phil's jaw, so hit him with the gun, then moved to do the same to Louis. Louis tipped his head forwards in hopes that the sailor would aim for the front of his face. When the sailor swung, Louis jerked his head back. The man missed, but Louis smacked his head against the mast. The boat's captain approached and chastised the crewmen. The mood changed, and Louis' and Phil's hands were untied. Someone gave the castaways cigarettes, but the ends kept lighting their beards on fire. Someone else brought them cups of water and one biscuit each. Louis took a bite of the biscuit and held it in his mouth, caressing it, feeling the flavor. He ate slowly, savoring each crumb. It was his first food in 8 days. So it doesn't matter how bad this biscuit is, Louis is just so happy to have food. Probably so happy he's not eating fish and bird blood. A second boat pulled alongside the first. Louis and Phil were helped onto it, and it began moving. As it sailed, a crewman came to the castaways and fed them more biscuits and some coconut. Then a young sailor approached, Japanese-English dictionary in hand, and asked questions. Phil and Louis gave brief accounts of their journey. In time, the boat drew up to a large island. A sailor approached with 2 blindfolds and tied them around Louis' and Phil's heads. Men got on either side of them, grabbed their arms, and half dragged, half carried them off the boat. After a few minutes, Louis felt himself being laid down on something soft. His blindfold was taken off. He was inside an infirmary, which is like the hospital area, lying on a soft mattress on an iron bed. Phil was on a bed beside his. There was a small window nearby, and through it he could see Japanese soldiers thrusting bayonets into dummies. Bayonets are like the pointy little swords that you put onto the end of your gun. An officer spoke to the Japanese surrounding the castaways, then spoke in English, apparently repeating his statement so Louis and Phil would understand him. "These are American flyers," he said. "Treat them gently." A doctor came in, smiled warmly, and examined Phil and Louis speaking English. He smoothed ointment on their salt sores and burned lips, palpated their abdomens, which is like rubbed their stomachs, took their temperatures and pulses, and pronounced them healthy. Louis and Phil were helped to their feet and led to a scale. They took turns standing on it, each with a man ready to catch him if his legs failed. Phil had weighed about 150 pounds when he had stepped aboard Green Hornet. Louis' war diary began shortly after he arrived in Hawaii, noted that he weighed 155 pounds. He believed that weight training had added another 5 pounds by the time of the crash. Now Phil weighed about 80 pounds. According to different accounts, 5'10" Louis weighed 67 pounds, 79.5 pounds, or 87 pounds. Whatever the exact number, each man had lost about half of his body weight or more. So think about these big guys who are weighing, tall guys who are weighing about what like a small elementary kid would weigh. They've just lost so much weight. They're going to be like skin and bones. On the doctor's order, in came a bottle of Russian cognac and 2 glasses, which Louis and Phil quickly emptied. Then came a platter of eggs, ham, milk, fresh bread, fruit salad, and cigarettes. The castaways dug in. When they were done, they were helped into another room and seated before a group of Japanese officers who gaped, who stared at the shrunken canary yellow men. Remember, they're yellow because the raft, as it was disintegrating, was dyeing their bodies. An officer, speaking English, asked how they had ended up there. Louis told the story as the Japanese listened in silent fascination, tracing the journey on a map. Louis and Phil knew where their journey had begun, but did not yet know where it had ended. The officers told them. They were on an atoll in the Marshall Islands. They had drifted 2,000 miles in a little tiny blow-up raft. That is insane. As Japanese servicemen crowded around, the raft was spread out and the bullet holes counted. There were 48. The curious servicemen pressed toward the Americans, but the officers kept them back. An officer asked Louis where the bullet holes had come from. Louis replied that a Japanese plane had strafed them. The officer said that this was impossible, a violation of their military code of honor. So Louis signed them that the Japanese had flown by and shot at the raft, and the officer saying no, they wouldn't have done that. That's against the rules. Louis described the bomber and the attack. The officers looked at one another and said nothing. 2 beds were made up, and Louis and Phil were invited to get as much rest as they wished. Slipping between cool, clean sheets, their stomachs full, their sores soothed, they were deeply grateful to have been received with such compassion. Phil had a relieved thought. They are our friends. Louis and Phil stayed in the infirmary, the hospital area, for 2 days, attended by Japanese who cared for them with genuine concern for their comfort and health. On the 3rd day, the deputy commanding officer came to them. He brought beef, chocolate, and coconuts, a gift from his commander, as well as news. A freighter was coming to transport them to another atoll. The name he gave sent a tremor through Louis. Kwajalein. It was the place known as Execution Island. Execution is killing someone, so this is not good. After you leave here, Louis would long remember the officer saying, "We cannot guarantee your life." The freighter arrived on July 15th. Louis and Phil were taken into the hold and housed separately. The captain had bountiful portions of food sent to them. The prisoners ate all they could. One of the cruelties of starvation is that a body dying of hunger often rejects the first food it is given, meaning that if you haven't eaten in a long time and then you eat a lot, you'll probably just be sick. You'll throw it back up. The food on the atoll had apparently agreed with the castaways, but not the food on the freighter. Louis spent much of the day hunched over the ship railing, vomiting into the sea, while a guard held him. Phil's meal left him almost as quickly, but by a different route. That evening, he had to be taken on at least 6 runs to the head. The head is the toilet. As the freighter drew up to Kwajalein on July 16th, the Japanese became harsh. On came the blindfolds, and Louis and Phil were taken onto what seemed to be a barge. When the barge stopped, they were picked up, heaved over men's shoulders, and carried. Louis felt himself bobbing through the air, then slapped down on a hard surface. Phil was dropped beside him. Louis said something to Phil and immediately felt a boot kick into him as a voice shouted, "No!" An engine started, and they were moving. They were on the flatbed of a truck. In a few minutes, the truck stopped, and Louis was tugged out and flung over a shoulder again. There was walking, 2 steps up, a darkening, the sense that Phil was no longer near him, and a disorienting feeling of being thrown backward. Remember, Louis' eyes are blindfolded, so we're experiencing what Louis is experiencing. He feels things, he has an experience, but he's not sure exactly what's going on. Louis' back struck a wall, and he fell to the floor. Someone yanked up his blindfold. The door slammed, a lock turned. At first, Louis could barely see. His eyes darted about uncontrollably. His mind raced, flitting incoherently from thought to thought, meaning he is without real organization, without making sense. His mind's just racing everywhere. After weeks of endless openness on the ocean, he was disoriented by the compression of the space around him, by such small space. Every nerve and muscle seemed in a panic. Slowly, his thoughts quieted and his eyes settled. He was in a wooden cell about the length of a man and not much wider than his shoulders. Over his head was a thatched roof about 7 feet up. The only window was a hole about a foot square in the door. The floor was strewn with gravel, dirt, and wiggling maggots, little white worms, and the room hummed with flies and mosquitoes, already beginning to swarm onto him. There was a hole in the floor with a latrine bucket below it, so that's your bathroom. The air hung hot and still, oppressive with the stench of human waste. Louis looked up. In the dim light, he saw words carved into the wall. 9 Marines marooned on Macon Island, August 18th, 1942. Marooned is stranded on this island. Below that were names. Robert Allard, Dallas Cook, Richard Davis, Joseph Gifford, John Kearns, Alden Mattinson, Richard Olbert, William Powelson, and Donald Robertson. On August 1942, after an American raid on a Japanese base at Macon in the Marshall Islands, 9 Marines had been mistakenly left behind. Captured by the Japanese, they had disappeared. Louis was almost certainly the first American to learn that they had been taken to Kwajalein. But other than Phil and Louis, there were no prisoners here now. Louis felt a wave of foreboding, the sense that something bad is going to happen. He called to Phil. Phil's voice answered, distant and small, somewhere to the left. He was down the hall in a squalid hole, a terrible little place, like Louis'. Each man asked the other if he was okay. Both knew that this was likely the last time they would talk, but if they wished to say goodbye, neither had the chance. There was shuffling in the corridor as a guard took up his station. Louis and Phil said nothing else. Louis looked down at his body. Legs that had sprung through a 412 mile over bright sand on that last morning of Koala were now useless. The vibrant, generous body that he had trained with such vigilance had shrunken until only the bones remained, draped in yellow skin, crawling with parasites, little germs. All I see, he thought, is a dead body breathing. Louis dissolved into hard, racking weeping. He muffled his sobs so the guard wouldn't hear him. And that is where we pause and move on to part 4. So part 3 of the book was all Louis on the ocean. And with Louis' determination, him and Phil survived. Their minds were able to be fairly active the whole time. They're okay, but now they've been taken prisoner on this island, and things are looking pretty uncertain for Louis. So we are going to pause there before we roll on to chapter 18.